Hello boys and girls, today we're going to be talking about my Elementalist Storm Brand character. This is the same character that I played before, which was the Armageddon Brand character. It is currently level 98 in solo self-on hardcore. We're racing to 100, but a lot of people have been asking questions. So we're going to be discussing some things about the build. It's not really a build guide, more like a build diary. And hopefully this is gonna help some of you guys out that want to get into the build right now before we actually make a proper build guide. So first of all, why do we choose Elementalist for Storm Brands? In my opinion, Elementalist is significantly stronger due to the fact that we can simply pick up a ton of damage. Elementalist pretty much has everything covered. It does a ton of AoE. It obviously freezes, so it's really cool for survivability. It is extremely good for defense because of the chill, and overall I find it to be a lot more useful than something like Hierophant that simply does not do enough damage. I know that Uber Elite has played a Hierophant and he ended up switching to a Inquisitor instead because he just couldn't cover the damage, and the cooldown recovery on the brand recall wasn't worth it because you want to scale it as far as possible. And here we have some of the differences between Storm Brand and Armageddon Brand. With Armageddon Brand, I wouldn't necessarily compare these abilities when it comes to just damage alone, because that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Armageddon Brand basically does a ton of damage. Storm Brand is a lot more control, a lot more defensive skill tree. We're a lot more likely to freeze since Armageddon Brand depends on, well, a big chunk of it depends on Ignite. Right, so you don't necessarily want to be freezing things because you don't proliferate at the same time. And also, Storm Brand is instantaneous. So if you're looking to do a ton of damage, you don't really care about your defense. Not that Armageddon Brand necessarily needs to be squishy, but it also obstructs a lot of the screen. If you just want to do damage, play Armageddon Brand. If you want a little bit more control, a lot more balanced build, try and play Storm Brand. And like mentioned before, in pretty much both cases, I would advise for you to play the Elementalist because it's been working out better. I wouldn't necessarily recommend to use Storm Brand all the way through. Armageddon Brand in general just works extremely well on a 4-link and a 5-link. Storm Brand will most certainly, if you want to play it from start to finish, require a lightning spire trap or some sort of single target, preferably on a 5-link, maybe with some sort of elder setup, possibly with conk effect in your helmet. You simply will not deal enough single target. Eventually you get to a point where you don't necessarily need it. I don't use it personally. Instead I went with a Vol Righteous Fire setup, and I also have it linked up with increased duration and Vol Grace, which is another bunch of extra defense paired up with acrobatics. It really makes for a quite tanky character with 8k effective life and leeching my life and mana. Unless you have a 6-link, I would highly not recommend using just the plain setup without a single target. As for the links themselves, I'm currently using Storm Brand, Ice Bite, faster casting, controlled destruction, hypothermia, and lightning penetration. If you were to only have a 5-link, like we talked about before, I would definitely take off lightning penetration because we have many sources of this everywhere. We also debuff mobs with a curse and hit hurl of thunder, elemental weakness setup, plus the penetration that we get on the skill tree, plus mastermind of discord for the pen over there. I also am utilizing a Sandbar Scepter, which gives me a little bit more penetration. We have a fossil crafted metallic helmet, which is another extra 9% lightning resistance reduction for everybody around us. So lightning pen doesn't scale nearly as much because on top of it, due to the Ice Bite, we don't fully scale all of our damage. We want to be freezing. That's one of our biggest strengths, and therefore we do need the Ice Bite to be scalable with other things. And maybe you might want to pick up some even cold damage on the skill tree. I know or not on the skill tree, but on jewels. I know a lot of people also would just go for conk effect, like mentioned before, just due to the fact that it allows you to freeze a lot better, and they prefer it over lightning penetration. Our other setups are the classic Immortal Call, with a Warlord's Mark, increased duration and custom damage taken. This is just so that whenever there's not any ads for our leech on the boots to kick in, we can curse things with Warlord's Mark, even if just temporarily before it gets overwritten with the curse and hit Herald of Thunder, and just replenish our juice. Like mentioned before, we have a Righteous Fire, Grace, increased duration setup. These you can obviously mix and match. I'm also utilizing Brand Recall, Flame Dash, Empower, and Arcane Surge. This is something that is extremely important. You want your Brand Recall to be as low level as possible. Unlike Armageddon Brand, the Storm Brand scales extremely well with Brand Recall. Not that Armageddon Brand doesn't, but Brand Recall really needs it to dish out a ton of AoE. You pretty much just nuke the entire screen whenever you have this thing up. So it very much feels like Vol Power Siphon. If you've ever played that, you just click it and everything is dead on the entire screen. So make sure to lower it as much as possible. I know Uberlead has been using the Solaris Lunaris shield, which has +2 to gems. You can obviously slap on Empower on top of that, you know, get that Brand Recall in there, maybe even get a level 4 Empower and really get your cooldown very low, which heavily increases your clear speed. It is an extremely big deal, and even a 10% difference you will most definitely feel. Also, it increases your single target because you can just spam it whenever you have 5 brands, so despite the fact that only 2 can attach, every time it's off cooldown you can use it, and the 3 extra brands also hit the target. And then obviously the Herald of Thunder, Curse and Hit, Elemental Weakness setup that we talked about before. I also have a Fortify, Faster Attacks, Shield Charge, Culling Strike. The Culling Strike is just there for the quality that gives us attack speed. It's pretty standard mobility type of stuff. You know, you can go with the Consecrated Path if you really want to. I don't really care. I was using Consecrated Path for the longest time, but eventually I switched to the Shield Charge just because I started playing kind of silly, and when you're playing kind of silly, you don't always keep up your Consecrated Path. And also in general in the Betrayal, you don't want to be standing around in one place. I find a lot of players have been dying simply because they stand around. Brand Recall allows you all the mobility in the world. You always have time to just run around and not get hit by things. As for the main focus of your gear, I would say life and resistances, as this is a Mind Over Matter build, are mandatory. If you can, try and fit some lightning damage wherever you can. I, for instance, have a Elder Leather Belt that I have some elemental damage on. Your shield and weapon are very important, especially if you don't want to use the Lightning Spire trap setup. Try and focus on flat elemental lightning damage. Cast speed scales incredibly well. For your shield, you really want to have spell damage on your shield, preferably on a fossilized shield. In my case, I ended up only having about 44 energy shield with a little bit of life. My shield wasn't particularly great. It was very difficult to craft for whatever reason this time around, but it's enough, you know, it does enough. But if you can get like a big puppy craft with like 70 spell damage, you know, some max life, some max mana, and have a whole bunch of resistances because you've got those suffixes fully open, go for it. It actually shouldn't be that difficult with like etheric fossils and whatnot. It just hasn't quite happened for me. As for your rings and your amulets, try to get cast speed like we mentioned before. It scales both your initial hit and it scales the frequency at which the brands hit. And the reason why it's a big deal is because I'm not 100% sure about this, but the mod that you can pick up on the skill tree, which is called, it's increased brand activation frequency. I believe that this mod is a multiplier. Therefore, because your ability scales with both this and your cast speed, it's not additive, it's multiplicative. So any cast speed you get also gets multiplied by the total amount of cast speed frequency that you get. But I'm not 100% sure about that. I do believe so because these numbers are very different than just flat stacking. So for your jewels, I tried to focus on mostly utility for my jewels. We don't have a sapphire flask, or excuse me, we don't have an onslaught flask. We don't have anything like a phasing flask, quartz flask. So you might want to get that on jewels. Something that's also incredibly useful is chance to hinder. it makes a really big difference. You hit very frequently. Also on Armageddon Brand, this is something that's going to keep mobs away from moving and getting closer to you, and you can continuously hit mobs as they do tend to run out of the range of your attacks. With Stormbrand, that's not as big of an issue, but hey, any target that can't get to you, especially in Betrayal, it makes a pretty massive difference. So again, Onslaught, Hinder, and Phasing is something that you want. The Hinder and the Phasing you can get on a Hypnotic Jewel. However, for the Onslaught, you have to make sure that you're getting it on a Searching Eye Jewel. In my case, I got extremely lucky and I got one with Life, and then a pretty high Onslaught roll, and then I regold the mana, which is crazy. But if you can get one of those, then that's fantastic for your prefixes. You do want that Life and mana, as the other mods are suffixes. And also another option, possibly if you're maybe a softcore person listening to this video and you're like, this build has way too many defenses. Like, this guy picks up all the fucking defense in the world. I don't want any of that stuff. This character is already tanky enough. I don't even need to worry about it. I'm gonna get rid of acrobatics. You can totally do that. You can get rid of acrobatics, pick up Spiritual Aid that we're right next to, pick up Spiritual Command, which is going to boost up your damage and also increase your mobility for the shield charge. Path out through Lord of the Dead, skip out on those pesky AoE nodes that we don't necessarily need. As for your gear, for your chest piece, I would highly recommend using a Lore Weave. I know a lot of people are probably going to be thinking Impulsa, and I haven't tested it myself. I've heard that it's not great because it messes with the chains. I can totally see that. Impulsa is still amazing just because it's a damage multiplier, it's a damage increase. It allows you an additional suffix on your flask, so instead of running grounding, maybe you can run reflexes for your evasion. It makes a pretty big difference, but if it really messes with your clear, then you don't necessarily want to be utilizing that. I personally, if I had any choice, currently I am using a Carcass Jack, but if I had any choice, I would definitely go for a Lore Weave. Gives us life, gives us mana, gives us elemental damage. Obviously the tremendous defense with the additional resistances. As for leveling, you can level with Freeze Pulse, Frost Bomb, straight into Stormbrand, probably around level 31 or 28, depending on how impatient you are. You're probably going to want to switch to Armageddon Brand for those leveling stages. But if you want to stick with Stormbrand and use the Lightning Spire Trap, you can totally go with that too. You want to be picking up Arcanist Dominion, going through the cast speed nodes, trying to rush the Runebinder node through the top of the skill tree. It doesn't really matter if you go through the top, if you're going to respec it later, it's not a big deal. Try and pick up Mind Over Matter whenever you're comfortable with it. If you feel like you need more defenses, just get MOM. If not, then don't get it. It's totally fine. Some players like to be more greedy when leveling. Obviously, you want Elemental Overload as soon as possible because we hit mobs extremely frequently. So that is going to help you out a lot. That extra damage makes a pretty big difference. And everything else is pretty much a matter of preference. Just make sure to not rush on over into the shadow too soon. You should be picking up acrobatics extremely late. You have a lot of very compact nodes over at the Witch and the Templar, and there's simply no reason to be jumping all the way over to the shadow too soon. You're probably going to see yourself moving into the shadow area only really around the time you're entering maps or right before. So do keep that in mind, that you can get a ton of damage and survivability before really having to spread yourself out too thin on the skill tree. And as for your ascendancies, it's pretty much the standard caster type of leveling stuff. You want to pick up Shaper of Desolation for your first lab, Beacon of Ruin for your second lab. That proliferation makes a huge difference. Pendulum of Destruction, and unfortunately the Mastermind of Discord is going to have to wait until you have your Uber lab, but that's not really a big difference. I mean, it does make a pretty big difference, but you should be doing totally fine all the way until then without it. So that's the last node that we do pick up. And as for Master, for the Banditos, you want to kill all of them. You can help Alira if you want. I don't think the build struggles with resistances. You don't really need the mana at all because we leech through the leech on our boots, which I highly recommend you get. It's a pretty big deal. If you have to farm Cruel Lab, if you're on SSF, if you're over on Trade League, make sure to invest into those. They make a pretty big difference. As for your Pantheon, which is super important on this build, by the way, because it allows us to have an open suffix on one of the flasks, in my case personally, I ended up utilizing the most powerful Alchemist Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline, and for that we have to spend some suffixes. So the way I fix that is through getting a Seething Divine Life Flask of Heat, and to prevent getting constantly stun locked by freezes and stuns and all this sort of stuff, I pick the Soul of Brand King Pantheon. Your smaller Pantheon is purely personal preference. I would personally recommend Soul of Shakari just because immunity to poison is pretty good. I went with the Soul of Ralkesh because sometimes I like reading chat and not clicking my potions, and that's pretty bad when you've got 10 stacks of Corrupting Blood on you. This way you've got 8 and you're totally doing fine. For the rest of my flasks, I go with a Chemist Basalt Flask of Staunching. I try to get Chemist on everything. The Chemist Jade Flask of Grounding, doesn't really matter which one of these mods is on what. And then the Stibnite Flask of Warding, the Chemist Stibnite Flask of Warding is my 4th flask. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Hope you guys found this informative, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Bye guys!